Hi everyone, my name is Shahane Silva, a researcher here at the Center for Policy Alternatives, and I'm here with our founder executive director Dr. Saravanamuttu, here to talk to you today about the recently published policy brief on national security titled Reimagining National Security for Sri Lanka, emphasizing both territorial integrity and individual welfare. Any remarks before we start, Dr. Silva?
Thank you, Shahane. Yes. The reason for producing a policy brief on national security is that in the current context, amidst all the accusations and allegations with regard to the Easter Sunday bombing, and of course, indeed, the causes of the ethnic conflict, the issue of national security is one that is extremely serious and one, therefore, that should be in the forefront of the public discussion. Now, national security hitherto has been seen in terms of external threats, the defense of territorial integrity and all of that. And what this brief wants to do is to ask the question of as to whether that is adequate for a country like Sri Lanka, which is essentially a multi-ethnic, multi-religious polity. So Shahane, first tell us about what is the concept of national security that you have employed here?
Here we think of national security like in the title itself. We want to go beyond territorial integrity, beyond borders, and understand that just because you have secure borders doesn't mean you have a secure people. We have to open up the black box that is the state and look at the individual security of every human being that is a Sri Lankan citizen. And that opens up a whole host of other issues that we need to start talking about beyond just military capabilities and securing borders in the age of geopolitics and geoeconomics. So there's a whole host of other issues that we really need to start thinking about when we think about human security rather than just the security of the state. Now, this is not to say that the territorial integrity of the state is not important. It's a necessary but insufficient condition for human security. You have to have your borders protected so that you can ensure the security of each and every human being, every single Sri Lankan citizen. But we need to expand the discourse on national security in Sri Lanka beyond just focusing on borders.
So with regard to the sort of the human security dimension, the stuff that has to be done within borders, what are you focusing on?
We're focusing on, in the context of Sri Lanka, we're focusing on more issues that have come to light as being more eminent as climate change, cybercrime, cyber warfare, even old issues. We're bringing it within the scope of national security like devolution because they're important from the standpoint of, in the context of the ethnic conflict, do we want to continue putting a bandage on the issue, or do we want to solve the issue at the grassroots, right? And that is an issue of genuine power sharing, especially with the North and East, and ensuring that they feel that they have an equal stake in this country's future direction, in its governance, and feel that they are equal citizens, like any other citizen in this country. So there are a number of issues that we're looking at in the policy brief that we touch on to sort of empirically illustrate this new, or rather this non-traditional conception of human security and moving away from traditional security dimension.
So in effect what you're saying is that things like constitutional reform, etc., can create a greater sense of well-being and welfare for the minority communities, for the multi-ethnic, multi-religious polity, and that should not be ignored when one considers national security. So for example, in terms of the agency of government that would have to look after national security or oversee it, who will be represented there? How will it be constituted in terms of its membership?
It has to be wide stakeholder representation in the issues of national security, right? One of the reasons why we have an ethnic conflict, or we had an ethnic conflict and it's sort of still the issues still
Continuing,
remain.
yeah.
It's because we have left out people from the table, and there is a certain group that has dominated that discussion and has put forward their interests, right? So it needs to take into account every single Sri Lankan citizen. And we need to understand that Colombo, the Western province, is not every single province. The situation is different from province to province. We have to understand that there are various differences, regional differences, ethnic differences, linguistic differences, religious differences. All of these different parties need to come to the table when we think about what our national security priorities are. For example, even when we take the issue of climate change, the issues that the North has are not the issues that the Western province has. You know, when it comes to rising temperatures that are increasing heat-related mortality, or the erosion of coastlines, or coastal agriculture and coastal fisheries, how they're affected. It's different from region to region. So we need to understand that all of these different perspectives, provincial and across various different cleavages, need to come together to constitute our priorities and our understanding of how to tackle all of these different national security issues.
Okay. Now, in Sri Lanka, we've often, well, we still, I think, have this confusion between what constitutes a state institution and what constitutes a government institution. Now, with regard to national security, you quite rightly point out to the problems that a multi-ethnic, multi-religious polity will face, as well as the external threats. So, what kind of agency should this be? Should it be a state agency, or should it be a government agency? And by the latter, I mean that every time a government changes, should they be able to also reconstitute this agency that's looking after national security, or will there always be people there who will be kind of ex officio members?
I think it has to be a state agency, really. There needs to be some continuity in how we deal with these particular issues. It can't be based on the partisan interests of the day. And of course, you have to review your priorities and how you go about them from time to time. But there needs to be a certain permanence, right? I think a good example is probably foreign policy. The foreign policy of this country, changing with every government, is not ideal. The state is permanent. Governments of the day are going to change with time. But how we deal with other countries, we are going to only be able to extract the full advantage of certain relationships when we foster them over a long period of time. But if we're switching, you know, based on the partisan interests of the day, or we lean towards one sphere of influence or the other, from government to government, that's not going to be ideal. And we need to have a long-standing, stable, predictable foreign policy, not only for ourselves but for others, so that they can sort of view us in a particular light, rather than one that is, you know, constantly in a state of flux.
Now, you mentioned the whole question of the environmental, the climate change, all of that, and the threats that they conceivably pose to Sri Lanka's national security. How about this notion of cybersecurity? What do you mean by that?
Cybersecurity is essentially the idea that there's so much more of the state and governance architecture that is now digital, right? And all of this infrastructure and architecture becoming digital means that they're open to vulnerabilities, right? So people with adequate skills and expertise with a computer can do all sorts of harm to state digital infrastructure, right? Just in March 2023, we had the attack on the email government domain, where 2.5 months of email data was wiped out. And it was essentially because of very old, outdated software that was running the digital infrastructure of government agencies, right? So especially when we think about the government increasing its e-governance plans, we have to understand that they also need to make sure that there is the adequate security for the digital infrastructure that they're hoping to expand on. Otherwise, we're just leaving ourselves vulnerable to all sorts of threats from this domain.
Do we have the capacity, do we have the personnel, the expertise to be able to build that capability?
Perhaps. I don't think we've seen it yet, given that, these kinds of events have happened only recently. And I mean, another recent example would be the TIN registration. I mean, when everyone
Tax
signed
identity,
tax identity number, when everyone went to sign up for it, I mean, this system crashed, right? So perhaps we haven't invested fully in the digital capabilities we need in order to sort of move towards this expanded e-governance that the government is planning on. And maybe we need to invest in that first and make sure that digital infrastructure is robust, and then we can sort of move into these other e-governance plans. But of course, this requires a much more in-depth, comprehensive analysis of what our priorities need to be in the cyber domain and what we need to be doing. And this brief does not claim any comprehensivity with regard to that, but there needs to be work in updating national policy and legislation and bringing the right experts to the table with regard to addressing cyber warfare, cybercrime, and making our digital infrastructure robust.
So now, therefore, we're talking about a sort of national security agency which has the military forces, the security forces, intelligence agencies. We would also have some sort of provincial representation, opposition as well.
Sure. I think that that's an institutional reform at the level of the National Security Council. And we can tie that to the Easter Sunday attacks as well, right? That this body needs to be a statutory body. It needs to be legally entrenched, and it needs to have representation from, across the across Parliament, across the spectrum. And there needs to be provincial representation as well for all of those, for the security issues that are unique to each of the provinces. So we need to have this kind of body that has all of these perspectives and also has, the wide partisan spectrum as well.
All right. What would you say if someone said to you, look, you have all of these representatives of the different interests in the country who are part of the National Security Council or whatever, and you're looking at, well, to the extent that there are external threats to this country, you're looking at the whole piracy question, you're looking at cyber crimes, you're looking at climate change, you're looking at constitutional reform and devolution. So what if someone said, what is it that you're excluding?
That's a good question. It's a very expanded definition. So what are you excluding? It is not necessarily that national security would sort of encompass all of these issues in their totality, but whatever is relevant towards ensuring these 7 core values that human security encompasses, right? Political security, community security, personal security, food security, economic security, health security. These different core values that we talk about in the policy brief as well, they have all of these different issues have relevance to that. So it's going to be that these issues have a national security relevant dimension to them, rather than this conception of national security sort of taking all of these issues in totality under consideration. Not every single issue that's relevant to government is going to be a national security issue.
Okay, so if I was to ask the question, then out of the 7 issue areas that you have identified, are there core areas? Are there areas that have to be given prominence?
I think it has to be given prominence based on context. The particular Sri Lankan context needs to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about what we want to prioritize. And political security, community security are still relevant today. They're as relevant today as just after independence, and if not before. It still continues to be an important issue today because those issues are still present. We have not fully resolved them, right? But there are also going to be, pressing concerns of the day. Environmental security is a very pressing concern of the day because of climate change. So environmental security would definitely be one. Personal, political security, community security, these issues, especially political security in the context of the Araga layer in 2022, where there was this connection between, what had happened in 2022 and the institutions that were governing the country, and the fact that people's rights needed to be sort of taken care of in an institution that had to be reformed, in a reformed institution. So I think those, off the top of my head, I think those might be the values that we can prioritize, but I'm sure that, almost all of them really can be made a case for in the context of Sri Lanka.
Yeah, now for example, with regard to personal security, there are some people who will argue that we must have in the fundamental rights of the Constitution that people all have a right to a job, and that, it should be justiciable in some way or the other. But when you look at your policy brief on national security, you mention personal security, you mention a general disposition towards providing jobs and education and all of that thing. But at the end of the day, are we positing the collectivity above the individual? Does it have to be like that? Because otherwise you can't really have a national security policy where you have to look towards individual needs in particular.
Of course, at the end of the day, especially when it comes to national security, there are certain, we have to understand there's, fundamental rights, but there's also fundamental duties towards the state, right? And for the state to take care of its people, there are certain things that it has to do where the rights and duties will conflict, right? And at times, we need to understand that the collective has to take the forefront for the sake of the greater good. But this has to be done in a countable way, right? You can't make that argument and then have a Prevention of Terrorism Act that has essentially, and I think arguably the case can be made that is targeting dissent, right? And valid dissent. It's been targeted at government opposition and valid opposition, right? So when we talk about, the state doing things for the common good of all Sri Lankans, we have to think about also, it's not always about rights above everything else. There are certain duties, but it has to be done in an accountable manner where it is not the state kind of doing whatever it wants. And we have seen plenty of that in Sri Lanka's history, unfortunately.
Now, a fairly large component of the Sri Lankan budget is the military budget, and there I think the largest component is probably recurrent pay pension. Now, what do you say about that? I mean, you're talking about reducing the number of armed forces. Is there any sort of reallocation of resources that you are advocating with regard to that?
Definitely. Just for some context, I mean, before the war, we spent a little under 1% of GDP on defense expenditure. During the war, it rose to maybe at its peak closer to 3, a little bit above that. The problem is that it has not reduced to pre-war levels. We still have defense expenditure beyond 2% of GDP. And the problem is that a large portion of that is focused on personnel. Over 60% of the defense budget is on personnel. And this is pensions, salary, lodging, accommodation, all of these things in a post-war society, right? Why, especially in this age of warfare, where personnel is not the priority, why do we spend so much on personnel? And why are we spending so much on the army when we are an island nation and it's arguable that the sea is the vital locus of defense? So there is a serious misprioritization in the defense budget, and albeit an already excessive defense budget, and we're getting very little bang for every defense buck we spend, right? So when we talk about reallocation, it's a reduction of the budget, also in order to get a greater bang for buck. And what we do is we want to reallocate towards the Navy, or we suggest that we reallocate the lion's share of resource towards the Navy, and this has spillover benefits for addressing issues like drug trafficking, IUU fishing, human trafficking, all of the issues that we see in the marine domain. And we can reduce personnel and invest in, equipment and the other, hard infrastructure that the military forces require. And that doesn't mean we just send people home. I mean, there are different ways of going about, reducing the personnel. We can have a voluntary retirement scheme. There are shortages in construction and tourism in this country and various other sectors. And
So we have to retrain them.
Retrain them. I mean, surely retraining is going to be more cost effective in the long run rather than continuing to pay pensions and salaries for 200,000 plus military force.
Fair enough.
Right? And then that has spillover benefits for the economy because these people are going from that to working in economic sectors in the country where they are desperately needed. Right? So those are some of the very, broad brushstrokes.
Okay, shifting from that for a moment, now we are supposed to be very much caught up in the India-China rivalry and all of that. Now, how do you see our foreign policy in terms of the future? Should we get more involved with India and all of those alliances with the United States and Japan and Australia that they're talking about? Or should we stay clear from that? Should we build our relations with China to a more institutionalized, formal relationship? What should be the way that we go? And people talk about non-alignment as being the,
Yeah, as the way to go, or multi-aligned as it's now called.
Yes.
The thing is, I think when it comes to foreign policy, yes, there is a lot of geopolitical interest in Sri Lanka because of its strategic position in the Indian Ocean, and the Indo-Pacific has come to the forefront in terms of the geopolitical stage. I think the one recommendation that we make in the policy brief is that we don't want to be too dependent on one particular party.
Okay.
Right? There were, suggestions that we were too dependent on China in the past and we fell to debt trap diplomacy. And we do refute that argument a little bit in the policy brief when you really look at the overall
indebtedness
structure of our debt, where it was mainly international sovereign bonds. But that doesn't mean that we can't fall into that trap. And it's a case of looking at, are we falling into that trap with India, with the serious amount of Indian investment coming in and India's renewed interest in us. So, we make no claims about that, but we have to understand that we don't want to be too dependent on one particular country or one particular bloc, because then we are going to get dragged into a power struggle that really isn't something that we need right now, because we have a whole list of other priorities before we, commit ourselves to some sort of power struggle where we're pulled into one alliance or the other. So it's really a matter of managing our dependence and making sure that no particular party or country has undue influence on us by virtue of us being so dependent on them. I think that's the main thing that we can say about foreign policy.
All right. Now, there are predictions that India is going to be the fastest growing economy within 10 years or whatever it is. Now, we're just at India's doorstep. So there are arguments that suggest that we should align ourselves much more with India because we can get benefits from their growth and all of that. What do you say about that? Will that in some way compromise our independence, our sovereignty?
It depends on the extent to which, as a result of all that, we are dependent on them. And, whether we start taking on things that, maybe to some people it seems beneficial, but when you really look at it, it's really favoring one party over the other, and that party is not us. One good example is probably the Adani Project in Mannar. Can we really say that this project is really beneficial to us? Because there are a lot of facts that have come to light, right? The environmental impact assessment was a joke by, all intents and purposes. We are purchasing wind energy at a premium from the Adanis when they are harvesting our wind energy
yes.
and selling it back to us.
Exactly.
Right? At a premium. And we have to understand that the impact on Mannar, tourism development in Mannar is virtually impossible when you have, these massive wind turbines and the impact it has on coastal fisheries, the impact it has on local livelihoods and local practices. When we really take all of these things into consideration, some might say, oh my God, this is Indian investment that's coming in and it's great for us because, we're getting wind energy and we were in fuel queues in 2022. We won't have that anymore because now we have renewable energy supplied to us by the Adanis. But when we really dig deep, are we really, getting the better end of the deal, or are we being taken for a ride, right? And when we think about, a number of projects like that cropping up, then who is really benefiting from this deal, right? Because we have to understand that there were local companies as well that would have really wanted to take on that project, but they complained that there was no competitive tender. So what is really going on here, right? If, we could have had a local company do this project, had the wind energy, and it would have been a local company that, benefited rather than a foreign company. Why are we not doing those things, right? Yes, foreign direct investment is important, but we need to understand, we need to assess whether it's really beneficial for us or whether we're just getting played out. That would be my concern when it comes to geopolitics and our economic relations and being very dependent on other countries for our economic development and our recovery from national insolvency.
Okay, my final question to you is this. Now we're going into an election, presidential election, presumably general elections thereafter. With regard to national security, what do you think the first steps a new government ought to take?
There is a lot of talk about anti-corruption and, it's very economically focused. And I think that's perfectly fair, even in the reimagining conception of national security that we're pushing for in this policy brief, economic security. But we have to understand that this has to be done in an equitable way, right? With everyone being brought to the table. You can argue that there are criticisms of even President Ranil Wickremesinghe's, economic recovery of the country and how he recovered. Yes, we're not in fuel queues anymore and we're not in 16-hour power cuts, but we have to understand that it was done on very high VAT taxes, consumption taxes, and the lower middle class were really footing the bill for our economic recovery when it wasn't really their fault to begin with. It was an institution known as the executive presidency that made a series of bad decisions that no one could stop. But it's not just, and this brings me to my point, it's not just about corruption. There are a series of institutional reforms that need to take place in this country, starting with the executive presidency, abolishing the executive presidency, and moving back to a parliamentary democracy, and a host of other constitutional and institutional reforms that we need to look at and we need to revisit in order to ensure that our system of government functions in an accountable, transparent way, and that doesn't leave the future direction of the country at the hands of one man or woman and their, perception of what should be done at that particular point in time. And I think since 1978, the promise that the executive presidency would have brought political and economic stability, which is essentially the call of the day even now, has been, there is no empirical grounds for it. We had national insolvency in 2022 and we had a 30-year civil war. We need to understand that that institution is flawed, just hasn't held up, and we need to go back to a different way of doing politics in this country. And we believe that that should be a parliamentary democracy where you have responsibility diffused over a larger body of people, and we think that it will result in better decision making that is truly beneficial to the citizens of this country. And there are a host of other institutional, constitutional reforms that need to take place. But it all starts with the executive presidency, because that is where the politicization of the public service, that is where the separation of powers has broken down, and so on and so forth. So I think there needs to be an expanded, reform-minded government that comes in, rather than just thinking about corruption and getting back this assets stolen from this country. We need to have a broad understanding of what really needs to be done when it comes to institutional reform in Sri Lanka.
Okay, so we require a kind of a new constitutional framework which will facilitate the adoption of policies that will provide representation and inclusiveness for all the peoples of this country. So thank you. Thank you very much.